Now, the governments of Britain, France and Canada have issued an unusually strong joint statement calling on Israel to stop its offensive in Gaza and immediately allow aid in or face consequences. In the statement, they say Israel suffered a heinous attack on October the 7th. We've always supported Israel's right to defend Israelis against terrorism, but this escalation is wholly disproportionate. We will not stand by while the Netanyahu government pursues these egregious actions. If Israel does not cease the renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid, we'll take further concrete actions in response. Well, Israel has begun allowing some humanitarian aid to enter Gaza after 11 weeks of imposing a blockade on the territory. But it's also warned it will soon launch what it's calling an unprecedented attack. Well, let's consider some of today's developments with Muhammad Shehada. He's a Gazan political analyst, writer and human rights advocate. He's also a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Well, welcome to DW. Let's start with your thoughts on Israel's decision to ease its blockade and allow some aid trucks back into Gaza. What do you make of that?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. It's basically a PR stunt meant to just buy time to finish off the Gaza question. Take Israel's own word for it. Israel's finance minister this morning, Bezalel Smotrich, was saying that we are only allowing the least of aid into Gaza in order to buy time, in order to maintain international support and prevent an international crackdown on Israel. And he quotes it verbatim. He said, "We're destroying everything that remained of the Gaza Strip, finishing it off, wiping it off the map." The amount of aid that Israel allowed into Gaza today is literally less than 1% of the bare minimum that Gaza needs for basic human survival. So they allowed 5 instead of 600 trucks that are supposed to come in. It's basically less than 3% than what prisoners used to get in the Gulag concentration camps. To put it into perspective, the amount of aid that Israel allowed into Gaza today amounts to 32 grams of food per person. That means literally 4 rice crackers as the only meal a single Gazan would get. That's why I have colleagues and family in Gaza who are telling me that they are eating grass. I have a colleague, a breastfeeding mother, who basically just told me that she's passing out all the time. People on the street in the markets are falling and collapsing and passing out. And she asked me recently a very sort of technical question, seeking practical advice. She said, "Muhammad, we don't have any water. We barely have salty water from the sea. We don't have drinking water, and I cannot breastfeed anymore." And she said, "I am afraid my son's gonna die soon. What do I do? How do I stay sane when he passes away in front of my eyes?" She was not being polemic. She was literally asking for advice to keep mind together when that inevitability happens. And that's the situation you have the entire population caged in.
OK, so that's an answer that kind of brings it home to people. And this, of course, just part of Israel's larger plan announced today to control all of Gaza, which sounds like this is potentially a war without end.
Yeah, absolutely. So Israel itself, Israeli generals have been telling us that they ran out of military targets in Gaza in July 2024. Almost 10 months ago, or over 10 months ago. There was a meeting that Netanyahu held in early September last year in which he asked his generals, how can we exact a price from Hamas for killing 6 hostages in Tal and Rafah? And his generals told him, there's nothing left to bomb. There's nothing, the verbatim quote, there's nothing left to exact a price from Hamas for. Nothing is left in Gaza to bomb anymore. What is happening now is Israel tightening the screws on the civilian population in Gaza more and more until they leave the enclave, until Netanyahu's vision of depopulating Gaza is implemented, what he calls voluntary migration, and what every human rights authority on the face of this planet says, it is forcible ethnic cleansing. It is forcible expulsion when you give people a choice between basic survival by leaving Gaza or staying in Gaza and perishing and dying either by starvation or by bombardment.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on a couple of clips we heard in the translated clip of the Israeli Prime Minister speaking yesterday. Paraphrasing Mr. Netanyahu, he said, from the beginning of the war, we said we must not have a condition of famine for practical and diplomatic reasons because we don't have the support. So comb through that statement for us, would you? Is it true that Israel has been saying that Gaza must not reach a situation of famine? And since when has Israel been concerned about a lack of diplomatic support?
Absolutely not in terms of morality or practicality or human survival. So early on in the war in Gaza, you had an Israeli defense minister standing in front of a camera and saying, "We will not allow any food, water, electricity, medicine into Gaza, period." That was his remark. He said, "We're fighting human animals," referring to the population in Gaza, half of whom are children, "and we will deal with them accordingly as human animals." That was him declaring basic intention. What Israel fears the most is not the famine in Gaza. It is the diplomatic pressure that such famine would result. It is basically the PR, the spectacle. Would it make Israel look bad in the media? Would public opinion or public support for Israel be reduced dramatically as a result of kids in Gaza being reduced to skeletal remains? We've already seen dozens of children in Gaza starving to death. Hospitals in Gaza have been overwhelmed over the last couple of weeks with malnourished children, malnourished adults, malnourished mothers, and elderly as well. I had a colleague whose mother literally needed medical treatment urgently at a hospital, and the hospital staff told her, "Your mother is old. She had her chance. We're rationing resources. We're rationing medicines. We're prioritizing children and wounded people by Israeli airstrikes instead of adults and old people." So she had to just take her mother home and watch her die in front of her eyes. Israel, what really pushed them to do this minimal PR stunt, again, 5 trucks instead of 600, is virtually nothing. It's just a photo op. What pushed them to do that is the fear of Israel looking bad as a result of the famine, not the famine itself. And that is an indictment on its own.
Let's look at today's joint statement from the leaders of the United Kingdom, France and Canada, in which they say, "We will not stand by while the Netanyahu government pursues these egregious actions. If Israel doesn't cease a renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid, we'll take further concrete actions in response." And Muhammad Shehada, many will say that this ultimatum has been a long time coming. What do you think prompted these countries finally to take this tone with Israel?
It's basically despair, exhaustion, futility. All those countries. I was in a meeting 10 days ago in Geneva with different European foreign ministries. They all reached the conclusion that the war in Gaza exhausted itself, that there's nothing left to bomb. There are no objectives to achieve. There's nothing more to accomplish, that Israel is not gaining anything out of this except Netanyahu's own personal calculations, his own survival, political survival, because he understands that if the war is over, his government might collapse, his coalition would be dissolved. And his basically Netanyahu and his coalition realizing that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to destroy Gaza in its entirety and push its people out. That's why Netanyahu is saying to his coalition openly that we are destroying homes in Gaza one by one, so people will have nothing to return to, so that they would choose to leave instead of staying in Gaza. With those governments, the statements are very commendable. It's a very, very major step. It's substantial. When you have governments that have been very sympathetic to Israel from the start of the war, from October 7th, now turning to this aggressive tone, it speaks volumes. But at the same time, it falls short of any practical pressure on Israel to change its policies. Israel does not pay attention to these statements as much as it pays attention to actual pressure. So now when you had member states of the European Union considering and calling for a revision of Israel's part in the association agreement of the EU, that's when you had Israel's foreign minister immediately calling on the Israeli government to allow food into Gaza. Right. But without these governments, their weight behind their words, the words are unfortunately empty.
If we can look ahead, you've talked to us about your colleagues and your friends, your family back in Gaza. Is it too glib to say that between Hamas's terrorist massacre on October the 7th, 2023, and Israel's response in devastating Gaza and its civilian population, is it too glib to say that between those two horrible events, there can never be real and enduring peace in Gaza?
Absolutely not. There's been many other conflicts, many other massacres, genocides that seemed intractable for a time. Ireland, 400 years. South Africa, over 300 years. Many similar conflicts that seemed way more bloody and atrocious. The genocide in Rwanda. and look at where things are today. Countries change, people change, as long as you give them hope and progress on the ground. Israel's idea of living by the sword, it proved futile. It doesn't work. That's when they have to come to their senses and understand that they cannot subjugate Palestinians indefinitely under what the ICJ itself has ruled in an advisory opinion, that it's an illegal occupation and a system of apartheid, racial discrimination. Israel cannot survive as long as it maintains that system in place. But to like a personal example, after the first Intifada, when there was a peace agreement, the Oslo peace accords between Palestinians and Israel, Palestinians in Gaza rushed to the checkpoints and hugged Israeli soldiers and presented them with flowers. They were willing to let bygones be bygones. They were willing to look forward if there's an opportunity to have a normal life, a free life. And as long as you're not creating that opportunity, the only thing that you're creating in Gaza right now is more hostility, is more hatred. And that's not fair to this.
OK, so that's a hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through that. Political analyst Muhammad Shehada from the European Council on Foreign Relations.